Pleased to say we're joined now by the Justice Minister, Heidi Alexander. Thank you. Busy day for you. And let's start on the immediate crisis. Prisons overcrowding, people being released today, more than 1,000. The expectation is that prisons could fill up again within months. Is that right?
Well, we had a dire inheritance and the Justice Secretary had to take a very difficult decision in the first couple of weeks of taking office to reduce the automatic release point for some people on standard determinate sentences from 50% to 40% in order to free up capacity in our prisons. When we experienced the disorder in the summer, obviously that has increased people going into our prisons. And so we don't expect to run out of space until the summer of next year. But what you will have heard the Justice Secretary announce today was not only the sentencing review, so that for the longer term, we've got some sensible solutions in place, but also a number of bridging measures in relation to home detention curfew, the risk-assessed recall review, in order to ensure that whenever anyone is given a custodial sentence, that there is a prison place waiting for them.
OK, I accept that you inherited a very difficult situation. I just want to play you a clip that I think lays bare the kind of consequences of this. This is Ellie. We're calling her Ellie. She's a mother of a baby who was shaken, who had life-changing injuries. The perpetrator is due to be released early next year. And here's what she had to say.
If you were to have a meeting tomorrow, what would you say?
If I had a meeting with the government tomorrow, I'd give them half an hour of my little boy and say to them, this is the person, this perpetrator did this to my little boy, and you're trying to release him early. Just walk a day in my shoes. And then say that your policy applies to us.
It's obviously really difficult to listen to. You've said, and I quote, that the policy has robust exclusions, which includes all offences of serious violence. What would you say to Ellie?
I understand how distressing the release of this individual will be for Ellie and people like her. The exclusions that we put in place in July were very robust. So we excluded anyone that has committed a sexual offence, anyone who has committed terrorism offences, violent offences which attract a sentence, violent offences which attract a sentence of more than 4 years, and a whole range of domestic abuse related offences, things like stalking, non-fatal strangulation. In order to pass this legislation quickly, we had to look at offence types as opposed to offenders. But I do understand this will be distressing for victims. That's also why we gave the probation service time to plan so that victims could be notified, because whilst people are coming out of prison perhaps a few weeks or months before they otherwise would have been, whilst that might sound like a small amount of time, for victims this is a big thing, and it's really important that the appropriate notifications could happen. Under the previous government's early release scheme, which was called the End of Custody Supervised Licence scheme, that planning wasn't possible. It was chaotic. And so it's really important for victims that we have appropriate mechanisms in place to communicate, but also really important for victims that prison places are there for people when these really serious crimes are committed. And the situation that we inherited in July was so dire that we were one bad day away from the prisons totally overflowing. And if that happened, courts wouldn't have been able to hear trials and the police would have had to stop arresting. That is never a situation that any government should have to countenance. And so we had to take this really, really difficult decision that we did back in July.
You're looking at longer term reform too. Do you think there should be more of a focus on rehabilitation rather than retribution?
So in the UK, in England and Wales, we've got the highest incarceration rate in Western Europe. 8 out of 10 offenders are re-offenders. So it is not working at the moment.
Prison's not working.
Prison at the moment is not working. And I'm not prepared to sit on this programme and defend the status quo where our prisons are overflowing. We've got the highest incarceration rate in Europe and we've got high levels of reoffending. And so we do have to look at how we enable people to turn their back on a life of crime. And one of the things we've also talked about today is how we expand the use of punishment outside of prisons. Yeah. So things like, home arrest, in effect, home detention curfew, electronic monitoring, tagging, surveillance, because actually with the evolution of technology...
I want to ask about this. Yeah. Sorry, there's something that was quite interesting that I was hearing about this morning, this watch that can monitor how much... Is it a watch that monitors how much you're drinking? Can you just explain this to me? Yeah,
so there's an alcohol tag, in effect, which every 30 minutes measures your sweat and can detect whether there is alcohol in your sweat or not. Look, to be honest, in our prisons at the moment, drinkers can get alcohol on some occasions. And so this is, a really quite an intrusive device. Well, I don't think alcohol or drugs should be available in our prisons, but sadly, that's the dire situation that we inherited. And so if you have one of these compliance devices, then it monitors your sweat every 30 seconds. And actually, there's 97% compliance. Other things you can have is, where a device, if you have been set an exclusion zone or a curfew where you are not allowed to enter a particular area or leave your home at a particular time, you could actually have devices which trigger perhaps someone giving you a ring at that point. We want to look at international best practice so that we can make sure that we are using the best technology so that we can look at sentences where an individual's freedom and liberties are seriously curtailed, but where, they are still not in prison, in the community. But that has to be, a really robust response.
Polling suggests that public think sentences are too lenient, but it sounds like that's, you don't agree with the public on that.
So what we have said in the sentencing review is we've asked David Gauke, who is a well-respected former Conservative Lord Chancellor, to actually look at how we reform sentencing going forward. It might be that for some offenders, the most prolific offenders who are committing more and more serious crime, it might be that a longer custodial sentence is appropriate in that situation. But we do know that short sentences often result in people leaving prison, committing crime again, going back into prison.
So you want to move away from short sentences?
Well,
that's the kind of nub of it.
Actually, what we need to look at is what works and what's most effective. So someone, for example, who is released and is placed on house arrest, home detention curfew, is half as likely to reoffend as if you were really released normally. And so I think the British public want to see a situation where for serious offences, the most dangerous offenders, prison will always be the answer. But we've got to be smarter in who we are sending to prison, and we've got to tackle this reoffending issue, because if we don't do that, we're just going to be kept in this perpetual cycle.
And just really briefly, it was widely reported that Shabana Mahmood was not happy last week with the budget, the way the budget was initially presented to her. It's now been agreed. Are you happy with what you're going to get from the budget? Is enough money going into justice?
Ali, forgive me, I'm not going to get drawn onto what the Chancellor is going to stand up and say next week.
But do you think this is a department that's been traditionally forgotten and that needs more money?
I think certainly under the Conservatives, the criminal justice system was often overlooked and neglected. And
so you're happy with...
I know that there have been some really important negotiations, and I'm very happy to come back into your studio and talk to you again once the Chancellor has stood up and delivered the budget next week.
Please do. We'll take you up on that. Thank you so much, Heidi Alexander, Justice Minister, speaking to us this evening. Thank you.